So we're going to start our afternoon session with Professor Ricardo Toledo Silva. I thought of Silva and I couldn't get it. Who will be followed by Paul Lewis, and then Vera will be the moderator of the afternoon, Yanni the moderator of the afternoon session, and hopefully we can also have some time to continue the conversation. Okay.
Well, could we, yes. I would like to raise some questions on both sides of the discussion started this morning. One is the academic, methodological side, and the other one is the pragmatic and how public works of such a dimension could take place in amid a fiscal crisis as we are living today. And the title of this presentation says a little bit about that, new prospects of integration when you have a situation of urban waters under threat, considering all the possible standpoints, because we have problems of intense floods, we have water shortage, we have problems of electricity generation altogether. And paradoxically, when you have a lot of problems altogether in parallel, it's perhaps easier to find out a solution for all of them, because we must face these problems. And the speculation, the hypothesis in this presentation is exactly that altogether these problems possibly have a solution that is impossible if we consider each sector isolatedly. We have two crises from which we have lessons learned. One is very recent urban floods of 09 to 11, when we had most of the São Paulo region reservoirs completely full and with an incredible continuity of rain of about 45 days that nullified all the possibility of retention on the reservoirs themselves, because it was so continuous and so intense, the rain, that the reservoirs acted as if they didn't exist. The water just passed through. So a few years after, by the ending of 2013, we realized that we were facing the opposite problem with an intense shortage of water that we are experiencing until now. I would raise two sorts of complexities to be considered to face these problems. One, the scale complexity. How do we consider the regional insertion of a metropolitan area as São Paulo, 20.5 million inhabitants, and a complexity of scope? How could we share infrastructure and operation in the integrated systems? And at the end, I will make some consideration about metropolitan navigation and strategic challenges. Because, as I told this morning, I think it's very interesting, the project developed by the FAUSP team under the coordination of Alexandre. But to be transformed into a reality in terms of implementation, there are some scale and scope challenges that must be faced. Well, you have already had an idea on the insertion of São Paulo state, this is the São Paulo state, into South America, and of the river topology. I mean, this river flows to the interior, to the hinterland, goes to the borderline with Paraguay and Argentina, and will join the ocean just southwards in between after Uruguay, between Montevideo and Buenos Aires. It's not shown in this map. It's southern, yes. And this area here, this part of the river, in the westwards from São Paulo metropolitan region, is used for navigation, for hydropower, for irrigation, for all the uses you can have in a river of this nature. This is the view, a general view of the hydrographic network in the state. Here is the region, the metropolitan region is about here. And the main river flows southwards. It's not only, there are other important rivers in the state. This is in the Paranapanema, it's very important for hydropower. And this river, that's to which the Tietê is tributary, that's the Paraná River. This is very important for hydropower and navigation as well. There is a very sharp concentration of demand in the eastern part of the state. This red area here is what we consider the Alto Tietê River Basin. This is a segment of the Tietê Basin that roughly coincides with the urban concentration of the metropolitan region. The metropolitan region itself is has a little bit different border configuration, but roughly all the urban concentration is here. And this is a relationship between the availability, the natural availability of water and the population. As you see, here we have 432% of demand regarding the supply internally to this region. It means that we have to import water from the neighbor hydraulic segments, or the neighbor basins, and must have huge reservation capacities. Otherwise, during the dry season, we wouldn't have water. And you have others are in the borderline, in the limit, 95%, 82%. Here there is there is a possible buffer, but there are other problems involved. And here you have a neighbor area in which you have only 2% of usage regarding the availability. There is plenty of water here. But this map is two-dimensional, and this area is about 700 meters below the level of this area. And this is why it's difficult to shift water from here to there, because of the energetic contents of this pumping. So we have as permanent challenge in São Paulo, floods and droughts. We clearly see sort of an environmental change, but we cannot assure that these are all due to sort of a climatic change or because of the very dense urban tissue that evolved there. And for us, that work with the actual policies without a supply of infrastructure, it's meaningless, because it doesn't matter if this change is is derived from a climatic problem or of a urban process created by the metropolitan concentration itself, the effects are the same, that we have this alternance each time more frequent between floods and droughts. And the adaptation of the urban structures pass through a concept that's very important for us, that's the cascading failure of infrastructure. As far as all of these sectors are interlinked, when you have one of these systems failing, you have as a consequence the other one failing as well. So it's not by coincidence that we have at the same time today water shortage, energy shortage, and also floods, because the specific location of the metropolitan area is not the location of the water supply reservoirs, which are much far away from there. So you do not have enough rain in the water supply system. At the same time, you have heavy rains provoking flash floods in the urbanized area. It's a paradox, but this is what happens. And all of this raise new prospects of cross-sector integration. We have a hierarchy of uses, and that must be considered, and I think it's an important dimension to be considered in the project presented this morning. First of all, human water supply, both in terms of depollution and water security. I mean the backup of quantities. This is quality and this is quantity, and we have to face both of them altogether. The second priority in the metropolitan area is flood control. The third, energy safety. I will show you how works the energy system in the expanded metropolitan area. Industrial use, irrigation, and navigation. When I talk to the team of the Hydranel, I always point out that it's a very interesting project, but it must be inserted correctly in the hierarchy of water use. It has real chance, provided that it firstly consider all the conditions established by the preceding use in terms of water hierarchy. There are some rules that we must observe here. One of the challenges we have when we talk about solutions with normally with architects, urbanists, and landscape designers, there is always a question between structural and non-structural solutions, or localized or huge developments. And one of the points that make non-structural measures very weak in terms of the strategic consideration is that their efficiency is not adequately quantified. You say, well, we have to face huge floods. Then you say, well, let's put on the spot drainage, how do you say, floors that drain the water, not asphaltic concrete. Pervious, yes, pervious pavements. Let's consider green fields, parks, gardens, etc., etc. Well, first, the urban land has a tangible price. When you make a park, you have to disappropriate area that's already developed, and this has a cost. Second, what's the efficiency of a park when compared to a pond, to a detention pond? We've made this calculation. The detention pond occupies an area that's significantly less important than the park or the public garden. Then it does not compete with the efficiency of an operated detention system. This is, I think, an important challenge for urban design and non-structural proposals, generally speaking. Here is how relate the metropolitan area and the Alto Tietê River basin. This red line is the water division, is the borderline of the hydraulic system of the Alto Tietê segment, and this is the metropolitan area of São Paulo, this one here. This area, the metropolitan area, is about 8,000 square kilometers. This area of the Alto Tietê River basin is about 5,000 kilometers. But as you can see, most of the population is within the borders of the Alto Tietê River system. When you consider the population of about 20.5 million inhabitants and consider the 8,000 square kilometers here, you will have something as 2,500 people per square kilometers, roughly. When you consider only these borders inside the river basin, then it goes to 4,000 people per square kilometer. And this is a concentration that's unbearable in terms of water supply and flow control. As you see, all the waters for flow control flow to this only river here. This one has its natural flow going to, it's a tributary of Tietê. But for flood control operation, its course is inverted here, and it comes to to form these reservoirs here. Alexandre already referred to them. This is the system of flood control. You have only this main backbone to have the flood control. And here is the scheme of the Pinheiros Basin with the, the Pinheiros Basin, which is inverted, not only for the purpose of energy generation, but also for the sake of controlling, of keeping the flows under control in the case of huge flash floods. Well, one strategic decision we took some years ago in 2007 was to enlarge the borders, the boundaries for planning and public works. Why did we do it? Because when you consider the metropolitan region here, the concentration is unbearable in terms of water planning. But when you consider all this region, the population raises from 20.5 million to 32 million in all this region. But the area raises from 8,000 square kilometers from here to about 50,000 square kilometers in what we call the macro metropolis. And within these boundaries, the challenges on water supply, flood control, and energy safety are more bearable than inside the metropolitan region itself. That's what I called before the scale complexity. We must consider now the whole scale of the problem. That's different from the past. Now, this is specifically related to water security in terms of quality and quantity. We have the reversions as integral part of this strategic action. And we have the scenarios in terms of water demand. For the whole of the macro metropolitan area, we forecast a growth of about 60 cubic meters per second to the year 2035. And if we manage to adopt measures of demand control, we could drop it to about 28 cubic meters per second. It's, there are several programs of demand control under implementation. And actually, I think we will get this result. But here, you see the macro-metropolitan interconnections. Is that map I told you before? You have here plenty of water, but the problem is that when you consider the other scale, the third dimension, then you realize that the energetic content here is too high to pump water to the metropolitan area. And what we have here in the eastern part of the metropolitan region is a number of reservoirs which are primarily devoted to flood control. And during the dry season, they have an important prime role in water supply. For the major water supply, we have a reversion from this system that comes from another state. These rivers, Camanducaí and Corumbataí, come from the neighbor state of Minas Gerais. And here, the rainy season is completely different from here. This is why we have at the same time floods here and drought here. It's, and it's parallel, it's exactly at the same moment. And the energetic use, I told you, is on this reservoir, we have about 720 meters of potential, and each cubic meter per second generates 6 megawatts in average. It's a very good performance for a hydropower plant. But due to problems of pollution, the environmental authorities banned this pumping except for flood control. And the result is that we have here a capacity of 900 megawatts, but it's operated with 120 because of the environmental restriction here. And one of the solutions that we are dealing with now is to finance the depollution of this water with a raising price of the megawatt here in order to have a cross-subsidization from the electricity generation to depollution. And this is just a small example on how I told you that we could face the problems altogether. Otherwise, it wouldn't be possible. And wouldn't be possible as well to destinate pure public funds to depollute this water, because we are not talking only about concentrated pollution. We are talking about non-point source pollution that comes to all this complex. And it's very difficult to control it in a metropolis of this scale. Here is just a particular, when you see here, I am considering at the same time five hydraulic units. We say here is the Alto Tietê, the metropolitan one, and the neighbor basins. In the next slide, I am considering just the Alto Tietê, that is the metropolitan area. And here is the operational scheme and that reversion I told you before. And just to have an idea, that canal Alexander referred to would be from here to there, from Rio Grande to Taiaçupeba. And the difficulties I see in executing that is that this is a very crucial area for water supply. And one of the emergency works we have now is a pipeline between here and there, between Rio Grande and Taiaçupeba. And this is pumped water under pressure. And of course, for opening it in a canal, it will have to suffer a very deep reconsideration on its project basis. You see, here is where we receive water from the Cantareira region. It's 33 cubic meters per second. Here is where the water, the metropolitan waters, drain naturally. And here is where they drain artificially. This is an operated system. Here is a very sensitive area concerning flash floodings. Here is also a very sensitive area. There are huge pumping stations here to control. And here is also pumped artificially. And here are the energetic uses, the main energetic uses. Here is levels, that's only for the records. I will not comment it now. I commented with Alexandre that there are some level and volume considerations that must be taken into account when designing the hydro anel, the metropolitan waterways. Another dimension I would raise for integration is the relationship between the metropolis and the regional waterways. The great challenge we have is to connect this navigation in São Paulo with the already operating Tietê River waterway. This is an important waterway because all the Brazilian soya production in the Midwest flows through this way. And here you have an intermodal station in which is embarked to the harbor of Santos here. There is a threshold between the metropolitan region and this part that must be overcome. That is a level difference, a very steep difference between São Paulo and Salto. It's about 200 meters to be equationed. I don't know exactly how, perhaps by a turning canal or something like that. But this is the great challenge, and this possibly will allow the metropolitan hydro waterways to be connected with the hinterland, with that one we see. I was fascinated by your description of the eastern United States hydro waterways, because what we see in that case is that the urban and local waterways and facilities were a consequence of a regional waterway. Even if there was not a very rigid chronology, there was a logical relationship between the regional and the local facility. In our case, the great challenge is to make this connection. In green are the connections that are the most important connections. In yellow, more or less, and in red, those of which, from the state point of view, are not priorities. And exactly this canal that Alexander showed is not considered by the state a priority, but it's important to be in the whole of the architectural conception. But this is why I referred to different standpoints from the for the academic conception, especially on a school of architecture, and the standpoint of the state public works. It's different. And we consider this segment here very, very important to make possible a future connection with the hinterland waterways. As we saw before, it's meaningless to try to connect to the coast because we have a chain of mountains that makes it impossible. So, what I would suggest as conditions for scope integration is to consider clearly the hierarchy of water uses. What I was commenting with the team is that it doesn't matter if, if the project, the architectural conception, considers its own parameters of water quality recovery. What it must be seen is what are the standards of water quality control that are established in the metropolitan water master plan that exists, and it's being implemented. I don't know in English the expression of the dog and the tail, but the idea is more or less that if you try in a project of navigation that's in the 4th or 5th level of hierarchy to condition water treatment, this is meaningless because it's like the tail moving the dog, you know, it's really impossible. And the suggestion is to consider it, sharing and actually share common hydraulic infrastructure. This is possible. When we showed those huge pumps on the Pinheiros rivers, those pumps, they are huge structures that reverse something like 280 cubic meters per second. At the side, you have a lock in which it's possible to have some sort of navigation. This must be the parameter and not the reverse. The state would never change the standards of pumping to allow the passage of embarkations. This is not conceivable. The reason is the reversal. The second point is the structural connection to the state waterways. I think this is very important. And priority on segments able to immediately fulfill the preceding conditions. I mean, when we saw on the preceding slide, if we have to make something priority in the hydroanel, is this tract here, it's this segment. Because this is feasible in terms of the other water use priorities. And research questions. We are in universities. We are talking about collaboration between two important universities. So, are these questions researchable? I think they are. Which combinations between water uses and sharing common hydraulic infrastructure generate higher net benefits? We are not considering the net benefit of each intervention itself. We are considering the net benefits of the whole of the interventions. I'm considering at the same time water supply, flood control, energy generation, and navigation altogether. Because insulated, their net benefits are meaningless to an intervention like that. Second, which segments of the metropolitan waterways are relatively more able to connect to the state network? I've shown before. And talking about the collaboration between Princeton and the University of São Paulo, it's very interesting to have a selection of American experience that could enlighten these integrative dimensions. We actually had an idea on your intervention this morning. Of course, it would be necessary to go deeper in those experiences to see the exact levels and the dimensions of the engineering works involved to make a comparison. I suggest also to consider some very contemporary challenges in the American context, such as the questions that are on the table today with California, especially the Southern California Water District. They have very recent measures taken about the water shortage that they are facing there, and certainly we could benefit from it. And these are the ideas I would raise for my colleagues of São Paulo and also for the scope of the collaboration with Princeton. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have the final presentation with all of these.
Okay, look, I'm super pleased to be able to present at the conference, and in some ways, I wish I could have Allison represent her what she did as an intro to what I'll do, because it set the stage very nicely. So, what I'll be talking about is actually two projects. I can almost think of them as one as a kind of before Sandy project, and the other is a kind of after Sandy project. They're in the areas that. Hurricane Sandy. So yeah. So yeah. So in terms of water events in New York, it's it's well known. The areas that I've been looking at, and really looking at it from a standpoint of design and architecture, almost a kind of speculative standpoint, which is what does one do in these kind of changing contexts. Both of them are looking at areas that are peripheral to the heart of New York City. They're not the downtown Manhattan. They're areas that are, in some cases, not as focused. They're not the places that get a lot of energy from politicians, but we think that they're actually a kind of critical component to a larger context of the metropolitan area. And what I find particularly interesting from the standpoint of design is the question that very, very small changes in section, and we're talking about storm surge as a kind of key question here, that small adjustments that can be measured in feet have dramatic influence on plan. In other words, what I'm really interested in is how very, very close inspection of questions of section can start to have very, very comprehensive and significant modification in plan, and how do you start to kind of look at those two together? And I'll look at that in this condition of two projects. The first project is in Jersey City. It was a project that was actually commissioned by the Museum of Modern Art. Barry Bergdahl, who many of you may know from his current curatorial work. He, along with Guy Nordenson from the School of Architecture, kind of set in motion the possibility that we would take storm surge seriously in New York Harbor, and this was done in 2010 before Sandy. And the thought was to get in about 5 firms to look at how one starts to take the possibility of a storm surge as a catalyst for rethinking the New York Harbor. And so the team I was working with specifically was dealing with the area of Liberty State Park. Here's Manhattan. It has a close proximity to Manhattan. but is otherwise kind of not part of the general day-to-day life or even the conceptual thinking of the city. It's a kind of leftover space. In fact, in some ways, many respects, as a leftover space of the very industries and systems and networks that Chris was talking about this morning. It's best known probably for the monuments, the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island, the Central Railroad of New Jersey, and the kind of infrastructure of New Jersey Turnpike. It's currently a brownfield site. We like to regard it as a kind of invasive species botanical garden. It's this place that has close proximity to Manhattan, quite large. It's about the size area of Central Park, but is not heavily trafficked. It is really the residue, or I should say, it was the land produced in order to handle the railroad for bringing people from Ellis Island into the rest of the country. So it was built over a period of about 60 years, 70 years, and precisely when the railroad stopped having as much demand, the area was less heavily used. And in a strange way, one can almost think that the landfill, the motivation or the industries that produced the landfill are in a sense part of the causes of the kind of global sea level rise that will essentially lead to this site's inundation in a sense. So certain prediction levels that most of the site will be underwater. Again, these models are actually even now, project is about 5 years old, and even then the predictions are being rethought. But the general assumption is that the site would under just sea level rise and certainly any storm surge would be inundated. That's a hard word. Inundated. And I speak English as my native tongue. So one of our thoughts taking this on, and really the question is, what do you do? What do you do from a standpoint of design in this context? How do you project a kind of future model for what could take place? And so one of the things we looked at is this very simple section, the kind of typical edge of Manhattan, or frankly most cities in relationship to their waterfront, is this hard edge, a kind of built edge. And our thought was that in order to even make high enough ground that could sustain itself in the future, we would have to work through cut and fill. And then in the process, we would actually start to look at the landscape not being a series of terraces, but actually a series of inclined planes. And in that process, be able to develop a series of kind of fingers of kind of higher ground that then would allow kind of cross-graining based on the kind of development of this landscape. And the main purpose of that is to develop a kind of range of coastline. The greater quantity of coastline had the capacity to absorb some of the energy of the storm surge, as well as produce a more intricate kind of landscape for design. And from a program standpoint, our thought would be that we would try to position a kind of, if you will, kind of anchor points at the end of each of these kind of fingers, but that as a whole, this would be a kind of new notion of a park. It would both be kind of productive in the sense of aquaculture, agriculture, combining also leisure with preservation and so forth. A kind of something that would take advantage of the kind of the fact that this place would be constantly adjusting relative to its section, that we could develop a very different notion and even a very different figure of the land in the context of the harbor. So that for the purposes of the exhibition, we worked with a large-scale model that we projected onto so that we could animate effectively the adjustment between low tide and high tide and really see the planned consequences of these very small incremental shifts of section, but would have dramatic consequences on the landscape, and that would be part of the design. The design would embrace the fact that water would come in. And again, for the purposes of an exhibition, we went to the level of fairly detailed aerial perspectives that would give a kind of sense of inhabitation. And again, rethinking how even the architecture would exist here. the building, say for this aquaculture research center, the building itself would be stable and the ground would be unstable, right? The ground would constantly be moving up and down underneath the building, the various kelp beds and kind of testing beds, and the building would, in a sense, be the kind of stable point of registration for these adjustments. Similarly, we are looking at ways to intensify the use of the harbor through a kind of return to issues of barges or inhabitation on the water, so that even a kind of music venue could then be accessed by water as much as by land. And then even looking at ways that one could start to develop tidal pools as swimming pools and buildings that would start to emerge out of the landscape, recognizing those buildings would also have to emerge out and kind of provide a kind of refuge in the event of higher level waters and storms. And thinking also of ways that the existing infrastructure of the train station could be utilized as a greenhouse, again, a kind of a testing bed for levels of salination for crops, again, within close proximity to the city. And again, a lot of this was in a sense, bringing this issue of how does one design relative to the possibility of storm surge, a storm surge that in the minds of most people, certainly in New York, was in the very, very distant future. Far away future, not distant future. It hadn't, and so although we were very captivated by this notion of a completely different relationship between the kind of figure ground of the land and the harbor, the show was to a certain degree kind of discounted, and the argument was, there'd be no motivation to even consider this unless, for example, there was a hurricane that came in. And of course, the hurricane came, and all of a sudden the terms radically shifted in a way that was actually quite surprising. And not surprisingly, this is actually the Hurricane Sandy inundation of our site, almost identical to what we anticipated. And of course, the site was heavily damaged. As a quick aside, we got the benefit out of this of being asked by the Parks Department to redesign Coney Island Steeplechase Pier, which was severely damaged by Hurricane Sandy. And this was an opportunity for my office to start to imagine how one would design an icon, not through design, but through its effects, because that's actually the interest of the Coney Island Pier. And so a lot of it was infrastructural work to stabilize the pier, to make it able to withstand another storm, and then to rethink that surface through very subtle things, animated handrails, benches for people to sit on, canopies for shade that would then cast the identification of the city or the location onto the ground, raised walkways at the end that would separate the fishermen from the sightseers, who could then turn around and have the view back. So we've had a very interesting relationship with the storm, and that's continued with this research project, Structures of Coastal Resilience, that we've been working on for a little over a year and a half now. So. And this is a fairly large endeavor. We're kind of at the more concluding side of things. It was organized largely by Guy Nordenson in the School of Architecture. And one of the key things here was to combine design, represented by four different firms, four different universities, four different design teams that were located in those universities, connected with four different sites on the Atlantic coast. But to connect that design work with a kind of climate and storm surge science research coming out of Princeton. Ning Lin, Michael Oppenheimer, Chris Little, Talio Mayo, and working with the GIS modeling consultant, Michael Tantella. And one of the key things here was to see the design and the kind of and these different types of storm modeling could start to work hand in hand, and they would start to inform each other. So one of the interesting things that came out, and I can't go into extreme detail, it would take like far too long, but just to give you some of the kind of highlights of what we were working with, is looking at storm prediction not from an interpolation of existing hurricanes, which is currently what FEMA does to set up their kind of flood maps, but to actually use global circulation models and to start to run thousands of possible hurricanes, which give you very different data as to the probability and the predictability of storms. That combined with a very close and precise inspection as much as possible of the bathymetry and the topography done together, start to give you very different predictable maps about where flooding might take place. And the issue here is not to actually argue one versus the other, but to argue that in fact to even identify on a map where you're safe and where you're not is the flaw. Like, that's the problematic issue. And what FEMA does now, so what we were doing is, this is based on our modeling, this was the likely 100-year return period. This is FEMA's equivalent one, and you can see that they're actually incredibly different. And that's actually the really interesting thing. And so one of the questions was to raise the very argument that one could, on one side of the street, not have insurance, and on the other side have to buy insurance, that seemed fundamentally flawed. So a lot of the work of SCR, structure of coastal resilience, was to work with the Army Corps and to, in a sense, where the Army Corps had a limit to how much they could actually experiment, to, in a sense, be able to put on the table design ideas that went outside their standard protocols. And so the work was being done in conjunction with the Army Corps' comprehensive North Atlantic study. And so the teams were each looking at 4 different sites along the Atlantic coast. And the team I was in charge of coming out of Princeton School of Architecture was looking specifically at Atlantic City. And what we are very interested in Atlantic City was this kind of condition you find up and down New Jersey, frankly up and down the Atlantic coast, but there's a particularly high concentration of it in the Back Bay areas of New Jersey. These environments that from a distance or from Google Earth almost look like parasites, these almost kind of diseased neighborhoods that have been, really is the consequence of cut and fill mapped to desire for individual property. They give you these very unusual reworkings of the wetlands into these kind of contexts. Not surprisingly, they're extremely low. They're just barely above water level. And so these are really problematic sites. And there's a lot of them. And they tend to fall into 2 different types. You have the type that's the wetland fingers, which tend to be slightly wealthier. They tend to be vacation homes, versus the wetland blocks, which tend to be kind of more lower income neighborhoods. And in some ways, we are more interested in looking at the wetland blocks, although recognizing that these things had a lot of similarities. So in specific Atlantic City, the entire Back Bay area of Atlantic City could be regarded as one of those wetland blocks. It's reconstituted wetland. It's not, when we think about Atlantic City, we think about the casinos and boardwalk that's along here. That's not the area we were concentrating on. We were looking at the Back Bay area. The areas largely for working class people who worked in the casinos, not the owners of the casinos themselves, and not the tourist areas per se. Now, one argument, of course, is that one should just restore the wetland, but that's, in some ways, we realize is not only kind of not tenable, it's almost kind of it ignores some of the kind of realities that are there. But it does recognize the fact that right now, most of the flooding that's going to take place in Atlantic City are going to come from the Back Bay. That's actually the areas that's going to be most vulnerable. In a strange way, the casino and the kind of heart of Atlantic City, although Atlantic City right now is all, that's the economic problems in Atlantic City, and it seems to get worse and worse, or another discussion. But in terms of vulnerability relative to flooding, the Back Bay area is significantly problematic, in part because the Army Corps has really spent a lot of effort and money on the beaches, right? This is where the effort has been spent to nourish the beaches, to build them up. And it's the Back Bay area that is an accumulation of a kind of patchwork of broken infrastructure, no infrastructure, or simply residues of failed real estate schemes, et cetera. So, whereas the beach, as I mentioned, has been lots of money have been spent on the beaches. And one of the things that we were dealing with is the problem of the kind of extruded section. So the beaches have been fortified, but they've been fortified through extruding the exact same section design down the length. So you end up with a kind of McBeach. You know, it's a kind of formulaic beach. It's there for it has almost no variation in its section or in its plan as that section is extruded. So this we found quite fascinating, is that the Army Corps works through the operative section, the kind of cross section that has been tested, has certain validity, and that its design, when it gets implemented in plan, as I mentioned, is largely about deploying and extruding it. So one of our questions is how could that argument be rethought, particularly if you start combining the possibilities of what was brought up of the kind of non-structural or the natural and nature-based features that the Army Corps is recognizing is something that they need to and they want to incorporate into their resilience and into their defense. But what the Army Corps is doing, even in these early stages of thinking about this, is they tend to stack these things up. They tend to take, say, a wetland or a reef, and they tend to put it in section adjacent to, say, a seawall, adjacent to other kind of defenses. So you get these things that are accumulated through alignments, again, because of the logic of that cross-section being extruded. So part of our thinking in this exercise was to say, could you actually take structural approaches, nature-based, and the typical kind of conventional features of a city, which are often not in the jurisdiction of the Army Corps, and rethink them? Could you hybridize these in different ways? And so this led to almost a kind of forced matrix where we started imagining different combinations. Could you combine a reef and a breakwater? Or could you combine a building and a groin in a particular way? So these are quick sketches, almost to force us out of the standard models of the way in which these are deployed. How could they actually be hybridized for different effects? In part, how could they actually sponsor new models for how we, as architects or planners or designers, think in these contexts? Okay. So moving specifically into this neighborhood, we decided to take on a particular neighborhood in much more detail, and take on the idea that this neighborhood, Chelsea Heights, was really, there were two models being presented for it that we found were again both problematic. One was the argument that one simply fortifies it, and there's an Army Corps analysis out there that says for $8 or $10 million, they could fortify, 1/3 or 2/3 of its perimeter in the standard seawall model. And this has a lot of difficulties. One, it's never going to be high enough. And because of that, it's susceptible to catastrophic failure if it's overtopped, as we saw in New Orleans. It tends to separate the community from the waterfront by the nature of that height. It requires a lot of maintenance, and ultimately it depletes the wetland and doesn't provide any ability by which the natural capacity of that ground contributes to the general absorption in the event of storm surge. So it actually magnifies the problems elsewhere. Similarly, the idea of retreat, the people are just going to give up their homes, they're going to walk away, or they could be bought out, is also problematic. Needless to say, it destroys communities, you lose your tax base, it's politically incredibly difficult to do, and buyouts are costly. So our question was, could you, through the agency of section, really, develop an amphibious suburb? In other words, could you find a way that you let the water to come in? Could you allow the lawns to be reimagined or returned to a kind of state of a wetland of sorts? Could you think about roads and any kind of barrier that provides some degree of protection as a kind of hybridized system where you get mutual benefit from these things? And ultimately, could we, in the act of rethinking this neighborhood, could we actually end up with, in say 100 years, a settlement pattern that's actually ecologically, and aesthetically, and maybe even economically beneficial? So that was what we kind of put on the table. Could we actually produce the amphibious suburb? The site of Chelsea Heights is one of the few mixed-race neighborhoods in all of Atlantic City. It's a very interesting neighborhood. It is lower income, and it's very low. So here's high tide right at the north side of the site. You can see that there's a road here, and it's barely a foot above the current sea level. The community just starts right to the right. And other places you get the wetlands there, and then the community is there. So it's this incredible proximity that takes place. Not surprisingly, if you go up and down New Jersey now, this is what's happening, right? So even without much motivation from a kind of top down, people are elevating their houses. Granted, insurance pressures are doing this, but there is this kind of very interesting condition where houses are being simply kind of jacked up on stilts. New houses are being built assuming this condition. And, which we found even more interesting, is properties are being built with this platform as part of the land. Like this is being sold as the land, right? It's kind of an amazing idea. So, and so this we found really interesting, but both from a standpoint of an architect, but also if you go back in the utopian models of the 20th century are all about elevating the building above the ground, the pilotis, the roof garden. Well, here it is. Here's utopia. It's there. It's out there. And we actually found this super interesting. And so we started doing some analysis of, we basically drew about 20 of these buildings. This was our surrogate lawn, where because your house is disconnected from the lawn, you build your deck as a surrogate lawn. It's a big deck. It wraps around the house. And one of the interesting things about these houses is the very simple question of where you put the front door is always problematic. Here's a house that got lifted, and the front door is marooned on a deck. You can't even get to the front door. So it's kind of left there as a residue. And even when new houses are built, they just get rid of the convention of the front door. Why bother? You don't even need a front door. So, but what you might need here is a meter reading pulpit. So this is a set of stairs that goes up so you can read the meter, and as a result, I guess, preach to the neighborhood. So it's just very, very strange. But for us, this was actually really interesting. This is happening, right? But what isn't happening is the roads aren't being lifted. So you have individual people lifting their houses, and that's how you can continue to exist in the area. So one of our thoughts was in Chelsea Heights, we have the advantage that there's not only roads. It was a neighborhood built in post-war, built with an excess of car culture. I think each road is 4 lanes wide. It has alleyways. There's too much asphalt, and so that's an advantage. So our thought was, we need to find a way to get the water in so that we can find a way that the natural process of water percolating back into a neighborhood can start allowing the wetland to essentially take over the yards. So in a sense, if we kind of took one block within the neighborhood, the strategy over a period of time is to recognize that certain houses are going to be abandoned. In the short term, some are going to get lifted, some may need to be bought back by a government organization or a private investor. We know that there's going to be a kind of adjustment of the section of the individual houses. But from the standpoint of the city, what they could do is they could start looking at ways that they could start converting these alleyways, these redundant alleyways, as a means to feed the canals back into the neighborhood. And that over a period of, say, 15 years, you may end up with a kind of less dense neighborhood, but the ability to now allow a kind of canal living. And in conjunction with that the local roads will have to start to be elevated. These roads are already getting inundated on a kind of monthly basis, extreme high tides. Money needs to be invested to lift the roads, but to do that in a way that still recognizes that there can be movement of water through the site. And that there will need to be some consideration to the issue of the boardwalk. And one of the interesting challenges on this project, because we were working with the Army Corps, we were trying to not design the houses. It was actually very hard to do this project and not design the houses, because that's what you want to do. And that's what I had my studio do this past fall. I had students work on that. But so the issue of how do you get into the houses, our thought is that at least the road would be lifted somewhat so that extreme distance, say for someone in a wheelchair, could now be somewhat alleviated, and the issue of the sidewalk or the connection to the house now needs to be taken on as an issue. But over a period of time, we're looking at 2050, lawns are really being slowly converted by the natural process of migrating wetlands. And that, in effect, one isn't seeing this as a negative thing, but in fact, the idea of a kind of amphibious neighborhood could take hold as a catalyst for new investment, reinvestment in this site. And a lot of this is driven by a very simple section, right? Which is to cut down this kind of, we probably need it to be wider based on some sketches we were seeing this morning, but the idea that one would actually allow water to come in, you elevate the roads and the sewers associated with it, houses are going to be lifted up, and so one ends up with a fundamentally different section for this suburban neighborhood. And that section then has the capacity with lower volume storm or lower storm surges to really become a kind of, each road can start to work collectively to mitigate some of the problems of the storm surge and to help start to provide some degree of a buffer against Atlantic City proper. So it becomes part of a better system for the whole area. So taking an aerial view of the site, we modeled every single building, school, and so forth, and started to look more precisely at what this would mean for the whole neighborhood, looking for ways that, this is the Sandy inundation that took place across the site. So could the first move be a kind of pilot phase on the north side, which is what the photograph we looked at before, to elevate the evacuation corridor, which is one of the projects that's on the at City Hall right now. But to elevate it in such a way that it becomes a berm at a certain height that's valved, that allows water to come in, and more importantly, develops a kind of wetland park so the notion of the wetland isn't seen as other, isn't seen as something that's not part of the neighborhood, but actually gets brought in and becomes part of the daily life of the neighborhood as the canals start to work their way in. This is, in part, this is kind of speculating 80 years forward, so there's always kind of problems associated with that. But our thought was that could we do this in a way that recognized that this was an inherently incremental process. Those elevated roads would, in the event of a kind of storm surge in 2020, actually work to keep the neighborhood more protected, more along the lines of a seawall through the floodgates, so that in cross-section here you see some of the things we're looking at. Again, a kind of sequence of sections for how that road is an inhabitable berm, a kind of what we call a berm with benefits that has consequences that are positive for the neighborhood. At 2050, the ability to move the canals through the site, to look at lifting the roads, so that even in this case, and we realize that due to sea level rise, the berm is not going to be sufficient in its own right, and that's fine, because at this point, water can come into the neighborhood, and that's not problematic. But perhaps the kind of public school, which is more in the center, would have some degree of protection through the sequence of lifted roads. And then at 2100, the idea that one has an amphibious suburb that accepts the fact that in storm surge, the entire area is covered in water, and that's part of its natural existence and doesn't produce a catastrophic effect on the neighborhood. So in order to kind of, in some ways what we were trying to do is use Chelsea Heights as a specific test case, but really the implication is that this could operate in a variety of these areas, whether it's Chelsea Heights and being able to use the alleyways, or if we're looking at Wildwood, New Jersey, which doesn't have the alleyways, one would have to look at that elevation and the kind of bringing the water in as part of the system of the road itself. Or if you looked at the wetland finger areas, that this would have to be done largely through elevated roads and recognize that one's going to have a very different notion of lawn. And what we find intriguing about this is that on the one hand, it's counterintuitive in the sense that it doesn't preserve a lot of the things one associates with suburbs. The lawn is gone as we know it. The house's relationship to the lawn is fundamentally different. But it's not in itself, in our mind, something that's actually either not going to happen, it's going to happen, it's already happening. The question is, how do you design it in a way that it actually leads to a kind of collective benefit, and ideally something that produces, in a sense, a new model for coexistence relative to climate change. So that's it. So thank you very much.
So this is a challenge and a big one. As you know or may not know, but in any case in the program it says I'm a historian. I am a historian, but I'm even a worse kind of historian than Alison is, because at least Alison deals with the 19th century on, and I don't. I'm an early modern historian. I'm going further and further into medieval every day. So I'm perhaps both less prepared to address the issues and in some bizarre ways more prepared to address the issues, because my view is necessarily more longue durée, and because of the type of reading and the type of approach that I have to both history and to teaching, I think quite a bit in evolutionary time and in geologic time in addition to historical time. And so those are the dimensions that you all provoke me to think of when you present, both this morning and this afternoon. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think I warned Bruno and Mario that when they asked me to comment, that I'll paraphrase, but I think I did warn them that I see my role as a sort of devil's advocate, as an agent provocateur in this conversation. So if I do that, please don't take it personally or as an attack. I'm basically doing what I'm expected to do, I hope. So I'm struck by a number of things, and that about both sessions. So I'll try to start with this session and then see if I can make linkages to the previous session as well. One is the issue of scale and the directionality of the motivation or the impulse for the projects for Sao Paulo, for the Fluvial Metropolis and the navigable metro or macro metropolis. And the other one, the scale of that Paul presents of one site of experimentation. And what is it that is leading to that focus? And it was very interesting to notice that for Paul, it is the changes in climatic conditions that transcend the neighborhood, they transcend Atlantic City, they even transcend the Eastern Seaboard. It's just that you happen to be on the Eastern Seaboard, and institutionally that's how you coordinate the research. But it's a very macro, at the mega macro scale, inward to the neighborhood type of analysis. To use the neighborhood, even though it is focused on a place called Chelsea Heights within Atlantic City, you are presenting the analysis as a test for what would happen under conditions that are actually applying to the whole planet, but in different manners. And that was interesting because in some ways it is a contrast to the earlier approach, which proceeds from the city of Sao Paulo and the urban challenges of that particular urban center outward. One of the things that I wondered is what would happen? Is it possible to combine those approaches? And I think that is part of what Ricardo was sort of aiming at in his presentation, which is to, yes, consider the problems of Sao Paulo as a metropole, but also consider Sao Paulo in terms of its place in a region, and a region that is not just in Brazil, but also a region that happens to be in a system of river basins that is transnational, and that from a very earlier slide, there's also a continental dimension. So I wonder if those two approaches of the macro inward and the city outward could be can be developed even more. I think that Ricardo offers us a way to do that by addressing the connection between the existing metropole and a conceptualization of a macro metropole and how that affects a proposal or a project for turning Sao Paulo into a fluvial city. I see a number of other dynamics here at play. One is that in Paul Lewis's proposal, I see an assumption of, and let me see my notes. There's an assumption of, hold on, where did I put this? There's an assumption that the settlement patterns will change. There's an assumption that the manner in which humans inhabit their urban settings and what an urban setting even is subject to change. It is, to make a very bad pun, fluid, because of the ebbs and flows of storm surges and climatic change and flooding and so on and so forth. And I am curious with regards to the Hidroanel in relationship to São Paulo. I wasn't quite clear because this would require that I mean, based on the presentations alone, my assumption is that, or my understanding is that it's the opposite assumption. The assumption is that São Paulo remains São Paulo is a permanent thing, and it will acquire Hidroanel and everything, but the settlement pattern will be what it is, with a fluvial dimension to it that nonetheless won't crisscross the entire urban space. It'll go around it, and in the last phase of the third canal, it will cross through. But it's not going to crisscross as in the sort of water fill model that Paul was talking about. So I think that that's another contrast that I'm seeing, which is what is assumed to be the constant. And in the São Paulo as fluvial metropolis, the constant is São Paulo. São Paulo remains, and the urban settlement pattern remains. That's based on the presentations. I would have to go and look at the material that you actually have online to see whether that understanding is correct or not, and it very likely is not. But I thought that there was an interesting contrast. And I think that there are implications to that contrast. I mean, as a historian, and as a historian that has looked at the fate of cities over long periods of time, and for whom nothing really about human history or human settlement or human society is sacrosanct. I happen to not have tremendous love for civilization. Sorry, I mean, and that's probably the reason why I find processing this a little bit hard, because it is very urban-centric, very rooted in civilization, very defensive of civilization. I told you I thought in evolutionary and geologic time. That's where it comes in. But what I mean is that I studied my first book is, and I'm not meaning to say propaganda here, but my first book is about the desiccation of the lakes that used to surround the city of Mexico, which was undertaken by the Hispanic elites and the crown in order to save the city from floods, at the expense, of course, of everybody else for whom the floods were a requirement of life, and without which they could not possibly survive, which meant all the hinterland populations and even urban populations for whom the seasonal flooding was a fact of life and a necessity of life. And what is interesting is that in the very first debates about what to do about the problem of flooding, the unexpected problem of flooding for the Spanish crown and the Hispanic elites, that the crown said, well, why don't you just move the city? Abandon the site and take off. Put it here. See, that's higher ground. Just put it there, no problem. And there was massive resistance from those people that had already invested a lot of capital, built capital, a form of treasuring in that city. So it makes me wonder whether there are similar dynamics going on here, because my question actually, when I see the problems that you have in São Paulo and compare them to these types of problems, and the sort of, true, we're dealing here with a neighborhood in a city that is not a mega city. Atlantic City is, not the same challenges as São Paulo. So I wonder here, well, if you applied your logic to some mega macro metropolis on a coastline, how easily could this be? Could this happen? I mean, applied maybe to Venice, I don't know, and we'll see, or to the Netherlands, to the entire stretch of the Netherlands, and we'll see. But the question that immediately popped into my head from a historical perspective is, well, why not let Sao Paulo be, with all of its limitations, and with its challenges, forget the hidroanel, move on. I know that sounds like a rather destructive proposal, but from a historical perspective, it's something that's been done before. In civilizations, cities are abandoned. And they're not just abandoned, and I'm not saying abandon Sao Paulo. I mean, I was in a conversation in Mexico City, the Colegio Nacional, about this very same problem. Another mega city, which is way more enclosed and has other challenges that Sao Paulo doesn't have, and which operates as a hydrological octopus in a way that is not that dissimilar from what you're talking about Sao Paulo, except that we don't have the differences that you were talking about in level, and that the challenges of transporting the water to the basin of Mexico do depend on pumping, but nonetheless. But you're talking about rather similar dynamics of Sao Paulo extending its tentacles way into its hinterland for water resources, as well as for the projection of its interests through a fluvial system that may or may not coincide with the state priorities, with the regional priorities, with the international priorities of the basin management and the continental priorities. So the Mexicans, one of the things that they proposed was, okay, let's not abandon Mexico City, but let's stop allowing it to continue to grow. So I think that part of the difficulty here is also the growth imperative. So because we are so locked into a developmentalist and growth imperative, it becomes very difficult to think of cities as remaining stagnant. Just let them be and do not assume the necessity of growth. In Mexico, the way that they were proposing the discussion was, well, let's decentralize the functions of the city, not in the way that you did with Brazil, that was done with Brasilia, but sort of in the productive aspect of the city, to export those to other places and therefore provide other magnets for migration that would not be the city of Mexico, and that therefore would provide less of a pressure on the water table, because the fundamental problem nowadays in Mexico City is that it's water. In a different way from here, from Sao Paulo, but still, it's un recurso hídrico with the same hierarchy of consumption that Ricardo was talking about, or the same hierarchy of priority of use that Ricardo was talking about. And so they confronted that problem with that proposal, which is, leave the city alone. Don't do anything to it. Just disperse the things that happen in that place elsewhere in order to interrupt the octopus effect of the city on the hydrologic basins outside of its reach, as well as the social and economic and political implications of that projection, which means that everything is from Mexico City in. And that I wonder, it makes me wonder whether, are we looking at the same model through this hidroanel at Sao Paulo? Is it one where Sao Paulo projects its interests regionally and then draws them in? Or is it a more integrated approach? So those are some of the observations that I have. And then also thinking historically, I am struck by the comparisons by the uses of history that Alison was talking about earlier when she commented on the first panel, whose comments I found brilliant, as well as the panel. When I think about the examples you give, the Canal du Midi, Languedoc, the ones in Paris with the Calanda Sarmentin, La Villette, Chicago, not today, but at other times you have mentioned Tenochtitlan. All of those things were contingent on extremely powerful and centralizing states. And those mega canal projects, those big think engineering projects of the Renaissance on, and in the case of Tenochtitlan even earlier, were state projects that basically served for the colonization of the hinterland for the interests of those people who presided that state. So I wonder, it makes me wonder about the dynamics of this, whether are we seeing a similar dynamic, especially because I'm not quite getting clear who exactly is the agent of either what Paul Lewis is proposing or the hidroanel. Is it the state? Is it private firms? Is it a combination thereof? And some of the quintessential questions a historian asks is who, for whom, for whose benefit, at whose expense, or at what's expense. And when we ask those questions, we often mean something very specific. If you answer those questions from a class perspective, then you will have to answer, well, at the expense of the peasantry, or at the expense of the working class, or for the benefit of the profit-making real estate speculators, as happened with the final push for desiccation in Mexico. That was the drive, real estate speculation, the humongous value of land. That's what pushed the completion of that desiccation project. So the state, there's the dimension that these mega projects in the past, in early modernity and before, are contingent on a state pushing them through, precisely because they assume a control of the territory that no other entity can undertake. But it also implies a process of colonization. Languedoc was colonized by Paris. It wasn't, incorporated into France because it belonged to France. No, it didn't. Ask the people there if they thought they were French. No, they didn't. So it was colonized. And so the state doing these mega projects through canals, through massive re-engineering of landscapes, in historical terms, you could really understand them as processes of colonization. So I wonder whether that is valid or not for the modern period that you two are talking about. And if it is, then who exactly is doing the colonizing? Is it some sort of disinterested and impartial state, or are they social groups that operate through the state for their own benefit or their own profit? That makes me think about that. So I have a lot more, but I think I might this morning I had asked the issue of financing, and that goes for both of the presentations this afternoon, and it also goes for the presentations this morning. Where's the money coming from, all of this? I mean, Ricardo, you were talking about, well, we're doing this in the middle of a huge fiscal crisis. So these projects involve tons of investment. And if we were to push your project at a bigger scale than a neighborhood, it's pretty significant. And you were saying, well, yes, the US Army Corps, well, that's a state, but also you were talking about firms being, so what is it gonna be, a hybrid of firms and state? If it is the state, then that raises immediately the question of, well, how will the state do this? Will this be going back to the methods of mass public indebtment that was typical of the pharaonic projects of the 1960s? Or is this going to be something else? Will this be by inviting Chinese capital? I don't know. But I'm very curious, because all of these enterprises take significant amounts of investment that we're not talking about petrodollars anymore, but maybe we're talking about something else. And that intrigues me. And it intrigues me in connection with the earlier question that I had asked about public and the degree of control. Who controls, who decides, who runs things? If it's state monies, then by definition there is a greater degree of control. But if it's private monies, or if it's international monies, then we're talking about something different. And all of these things have implications in my view. I realize I'm not really asking questions, but more tossing out thoughts, and perhaps that's okay. I was really struck by one of the research questions of Ricardo about, you were asking to what extent we could use, let me go back to them. You had 3 research questions. Which combination of water use, well, I won't repeat them, but at the last question you said, which American experience could enlighten these integrative dimensions that you had analyzed? And I was going to say, well, because of all that I just said, I don't think the American experience alone is enough, quite frankly. And it isn't enough because these massive interventions on landscapes do not play out and have their effects in decades or even in short centuries. So the American experience is, I'm afraid, too short, the North American experience, to provide a historical experimental ground for what you can get when you intervene on such a scale on human populations and human ecological landscapes, on built or unbuilt landscapes at such a scale. So I think it's more appropriate to think of a broader historical time, and even more so because we're talking about modifying geohydrological processes that whose effects take a long time to show up. I mean, now we're seeing what the effects of the desiccation were in the basin of Mexico, but it's not even the beginning of the effects, it's just the tip. So I think that the experiences, in terms of, you invited 2 historians to comment. It makes me puzzled about the extent to which historians' voice would work in these questions and research. Are we here to provide background, or are we here to provoke? Are we here to point historical problems, and you then will say, yeah, that's very interesting. Okay, let's moving on. So I'm very curious about what the role of the historians is in this process of discussion of very regionalized problems, of recrafting of an entire city and its relationship with its hydro hinterland here. But from the third question that you asked, my impression is that the role of a historian would be to really try to bring in the historical experimental ground that you cannot possibly repeat. You can't do an experiment on existing populations, but you can use historical experience to determine what are the possible outcomes for different kinds of interventions. And then, yeah, I'm going to shut up, but I think that there are many themes that we could discuss that were left over from the last panel that we didn't really get into in great detail, but that were very fruitful. There's also the question of obsolescence. So what time frame into the future are we projecting our period's priorities? I mean, everything you put in the landscape is going to last a long time, and it's going to legate to future generations our understandings and our priorities. So how are we thinking about the obsolescence of our own perspectives projected into the future? Then I'm also wondering about this issue of land values that was addressed sort of tangentially by Ricardo, and I don't remember very much if Paul was doing that. But in the case of Mexico, the whole process of desiccation was linked to speculation, land value speculation. And a lot of the New York filling in of the water lots, that was not just commercial, but real estate speculation. Just read Ted Steinberg, Gotham Unbound, and that's what it is. So I wonder, is that there somewhere? And how do these projects contemplate that factor that will intervene sooner or later? Then for the specific project in São Paulo, I was very struck by the role of garbage and the need to move garbage. And so I wondered, why is the focus garbage in terms of, why is the prime thing the garbage? That was sort of puzzling. Earlier I had raised the question of decision making. We're talking about mega transformations of landscapes that have humans in them for the long term. Who makes the decisions and how? About these things. So those are some of the questions, and perhaps I might reiterate some of Alison's this morning, because I think that she was brilliant. Not to flatter my own colleagues, but she just happens to be brilliant. And then she had her last point was the issue of technology, and it's Paul's sort of images bring that to mind a lot, with people doing their own domestic elevations of it. It reminds me that technology, just because you introduce a new technology, the old technologies don't go away. Everything continues in use, and it's a question of figuring out, well, how exactly do they interact, and do we design that interact? I'm not a designer, but I would imagine that would be a prime problem for a design at this scale. And Ricardo was kind of addressing that when he talked about using existing infrastructures that are already sort of acquiescing to the water use priorities that are embedded, that are the logic embedded in current technological systems. So the technological dimensions of what persists and what is innovated, and how do you design, and can you even design the overlap between all of those when a lot of the people that are doing the coexistence are like the homeowners that just raise their own houses. You can't. There's a level of control at which it's difficult to penetrate. And then the question of the technology brings me to an additional question, which is the issue of reversibility. You're talking about water fill as opposed to landfill, and we're talking about reverting to pre-existing conditions. I mean, in New York, that will be basically letting New York go back to what it was, sort of in terms of how far the water went. So all of these technological interventions, do you, when you're considering the issue of design, consider reversibility? Or is that not a function of design? And if it isn't a function of design, given the drastically changing climatic, ecological conditions, shouldn't it be a factor of design to introduce reversibility into systems like this that are so transformative and so radically transformative? I'll leave it there. So, your chair.
Thank you very much, Vera. I think you gave us enough material to work for the next 15 minutes. Of course.
We only
I
have
would
15
like
minutes.
to. Well, we're supposed to go for 5 minutes. So, but of course, we can always, like, I was flexible in the morning, so I could be flexible again in the afternoon. But I would like to set up some rules, so and some priorities, so everybody has the chance to express their questions or respond to questions. So I would ask, my request is that let's not have lectures now, but brief responses, and I would suggest that we start with Ricardo and Paul, who gave their presentations this afternoon, and then I know that Alexandra is definitely anxious to respond to your critique and defend the possibility of a hydroelectric, which you just demolished.
I did not. Stop it.
No, I'm exaggerating. So Ricardo.
Well, thank you. I think I wouldn't be able to answer or to point about all the questions raised, because in the first place, I am not an expert on some of the issues you raised. And second, it would require another day to consider all these dimensions. However, I would like to point some of that. As I told you, I have a double insertion in this process. Part as an academic, and a senior professor is the designation in Brazil for a retired old man that still bother the university with some postgraduate supervision. But my main professional concern is as a public officer in the State Secretariat of Energy. And we are, until the last year, I was also managing the water crisis for urban supply. And as public officers, we are supposed to offer immediate answers to immediate problems. We are talking about urban concentration of 20 million people and a regional, next regional concentration of about 32 million people. So if we do not give a proper answer to water shortage or energy shortage or flood that blocks all the traffic and you have also the problem of human lives involved in it. If we do not offer proper answers, we give rise to very serious problems of with unbearable social implications. So we are, first of all, pragmatic. We must offer proper answers to immediate problems. And when we design strategic solutions for the medium and long terms, we always think about the connection of three basic conditions to keep more or less balanced the social and economic development, which are water, energy, and logistics altogether. When we talk about the relationships between metropolitan São Paulo and the rest of Brazil, we are talking about very crucial logistics. We are talking about an economic movement of all the Brazilian production of soya, of animal protein, and other commodities that respond for most of the national GNP. So we are talking about some dimensions which are crucial to keep the economic balance of the country as a whole. This is not because we wished or we made any sort of choice on that. The location, this particular location of São Paulo city, has always been strategic since the 1500s when the colonization started in Brazil, because the rivers and those connections to the west make possible the entering of the Portuguese colonizers to the hinterland, up to, as Alexander mentioned, up to the Pacific shore through Peru and today Peru and Chile. So we are talking about a very strategic location that has historic roots in the very young history of my country. I'm not talking about a country with thousands of years like China or India. I'm talking about a country with a recent history of about 500 years. And when you look at the urban scale, changes are still much quicker than that. Until the ending of the 19th century, São Paulo had a population, until the third quarter of the 19th century, the population of São Paulo Metropolis was about 30,000 people. And it remained like that since the 1700s. I mean, in about 200 years, it didn't change. But when we passed from the 19th to the 20th century, this population raised to about 240,000 people. It means that it was multiplied by 8, more or less. And from the beginning of the 20th century to now, we have this explosion to 20 million people. On the other hand, we are talking about 20 million people from the last 10 years, more or less. the population growth is stationary. Since the 1980s, the growth rates are decreasing. So this gives us some comfort to deal with medium-term policies. In one way or another, the process of letting go of decentralizing is already happening. When I showed the macro metropolitan area, there are three other metropolitan regions included, but they are not as huge as São Paulo. They are medium-sized metropolitan regions of about 1 to 2 million people. So we are now facing a more or less stable process of development. This is the reality we have to deal with now. Unfortunately, I think we couldn't base our decisions on the long-term historical processes because this wouldn't be practical for answering the demands we have to fulfill today. You asked for whose benefit and at whose expense. It's well known that Brazil is one of the most unfair countries in terms of social distribution of wealth. That's for sure. In spite of that, if we do not promote economic growth, we certainly will create an unbearable social explosion. It's better to keep growing, regardless the social unbalance, than to promote any sort of economic freezing, whose social costs would be immediate and unbearable.
The explosion is unbearable.
Yeah, the consequences of it. I'm talking about people, real people who couldn't survive to that. So our responsibility as public agents is beyond idealized standards of income distribution. We must keep the engine working. Anyway, this is what I have to say on these general questions.
Look, one of the things that I find fascinating is the Chelsea Heights, Sao Paulo. I can't say, and by way of comparison, but by way of comparison, no, I think the issue of the who's funding this and the role of the state or the federal government. I mean, look, this was the work we did was funded by Rockefeller Foundation, which has its own kind of association, NGO, and it was specifically to look at alternative models to start to bias how the U.S. Army Corps functions. So there's no question where the agency is, but our role was really a kind of tweaking issue or torquing really of that. And the reason for that is what you have now in place is this kind of vicious cycle where the Army Corps will only reinforce seawalls or build beaches when they can actually prove that what they're building has a cost-benefit analysis. Not surprisingly, they rebuild beaches for wealthy people's houses. That makes those areas to build on more valuable. The costs go up. They can now justify building the beaches again, and it just keeps looping. The flip side of that, of course, is you take places like Chelsea Heights, low-income neighborhoods, and not only is the valuation of their neighborhood sufficiently low that it can't fund the seawall, but also the models, what the people in those neighborhoods then clamor for are to preserve a kind of status quo of what they already know. And so what we were trying to do is come in and change the conversation and change the way in which that was approached. And part of that was to say, that in fact the notion of the seawall as the only means to then protect the lawn needs to be replaced by a different model, and a model that can have economic advantage for the very people who stay in that area. But it means changing the conception of what your neighborhood is. It's not lawns, front yards, stoops, et cetera. It's a very different architectural and urban environment. And our role in some ways to start to produce some visualization that would imagine this as a viable future. And therefore, and this is the other argument, is to then also modify how the Army Corps goes about, and frankly how the state of New Jersey goes about deploying the relatively small amount of money they're going to do. They don't build a crappy metal seawall that's not going to do very much, but they might invest strategically in raising roads, which they could draw from the funds of the Department of Transportation. And what's interesting is when we first made we proposed it to the New Jersey government, and the first reaction was, yeah, okay, interesting. This is, we don't consider projects like this. We didn't hear anything. They came back to us 6 months later and said, we're in a real bind. We don't know what to do. What you proposed is actually the way we think we should move forward. And now they're actually looking at this as a model for how they're going to potentially deal with these neighborhoods, because there's a national grant available for national resiliency. So there's no question that what this is doing is working with state money. The issue, though, and this is for us was super important, is that it was done in a way that ultimately has the possibility of increasing the value of the land of the very people who are there, and finding ways to encourage investment in that neighborhood that now is not possible in the cycles of evaluation and funding that the Army Corps goes through. So.
Very good. You had a very brief comment, and then Alexander.
And it's a question, a concrete question for Ricardo, but it sort of starts with a comment on Paul's presentation, which is self-evident for the majority of architects in the room, but not always self-evident for policymakers, social scientists, economists, the extent to which you show us all the ways in which form matters, right? I mean, not all growth looks the same, right? We need to think of morphology when we think of how cities continue to develop, because partly this sort of very tempting model of thinking of political representation, decentralizing, doesn't really have an analogy when we think of infrastructure. I mean, the decentralizing of infrastructure can have, frankly, catastrophic environmental consequences. Right? It can be a lot, right? Like sprawl. I mean, water systems can be a lot less efficient when we, horizontally than we think them vertically, et cetera. Which leads me to a question for Ricardo, because there was a map you showed which does consider spatial variables, but at a very broad scale. And that's the one that had São Paulo's water demand is 432%, I think, higher than the availability, which of course tells us something about the population differences between the areas which you showed us, but it doesn't tell us that to the level of sort of individuals. So if we were actually to break those numbers down to the individual level, would it then show us that São Paulo is in fact more efficient than surrounding areas which have an oversupply of water? Right? When we think of the embeddedness of energy and how water gets to sort of individual households. And then my other question was about the hierarchy of water uses and how we have to think of the Hidroanel taking that into account. I mean, it's a hierarchy that makes perfect sense, that navigation would be at the bottom. But what if we thought of, or is it possible, you think, and this is a question for all of you, to sort of, instead of framing it as navigation, framing it as mobility, to then thinking this not only in the context of the water crisis, but of the public transportation and the mobility crisis. Right? Does this then leave more political room for this to be conceived as a viable project?
Starting for the second question, that's for sure, yeah. When in the project, multimodal project, asked the waterways, cost-benefit analysis must be done, both regarding the water systems and the multi-use of waters, and the alternative transport modes. When I referred to the state waterways, not the metropolitan, but the wider ones. The main question involved there is an economic equation comparing different modes of transport and logistics. The 2014 drought last year implied raising costs of transport by nearly 40% for transporting the commodities coming from the Brazilian Midwest, because we had to change the mode. Instead of coming by waterways, it came by large lorries moved by diesel. So it's the cost immediately reflected on the final cost of transport. And regarding your first question, I wouldn't say that the individual consumption standards in São Paulo metropolitan region are necessarily more efficient than the neighbors. But in reality, they are less. I mean, the average consumption for an inhabitant in metropolitan São Paulo is about 150 liters per person per day. When compared, for instance, to Rio de Janeiro, where this figure raises to 200 to 110 liters per person per day, we would say, well, São Paulo is more efficient. There is, in your question, there is a dimension that I would like to complete something that was raised by Vera. It is who is paying, where is the money coming from? We are talking about public services and public prices, which are very heavily regulated. These prices are under very strict regulatory control. And what we foresee for the next cycle on the supply of public utilities in Brazil is that there will be a dramatic raising of these prices. Because when we talk about water security, we are talking about doubling the facilities for supply without doubling the actual demand. The demand remains the same. So the cost involved in producing this extra water for security is will have to be translated into the water price. Yeah. The same is applied to energy. This has let's say some very undesirable social implication. On the other hand, it really pushes efficient systems of water and energy usage, because you do not need so much water and so much energy for the daily activities of the family. We have very inefficient appliances, generally speaking. And when you compare, for instance, with cell phones, with video communication, nobody cares about paying, even for a low-income family, a very high amount of money for to keep his or her mobile phone. When you compare the bill of a mobile phone with the water or electricity bill, it's you may say that it's 2, 3, or 4 times the water or electricity bill. So why shouldn't we change this relationship, considering that those other services are really essential and are really costly, and they will cost more in a huge metropolitan concentration than in a medium-sized city. There is a cost to live in a metropolis, and this cost must be paid. And I think this is the equation, and perhaps this pushes the natural decentralization and the natural moving away of the people that could do it.
Well, I also wanted to ask Christina and Angelo for comments. That is, I don't want it to
I was thinking.
be observers, but
have a lot of
but I'm
questions.
sure that you definitely have things to say. So you're saying, Alexandre, you defer to...
Professor Ricardo answered.
Hmm?
Professor Ricardo answered. Because I repeat the same.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, I would like to say that I really enjoyed the day. I enjoyed a lot of presentations. I mean, the morning, the afternoon session, very nice to learn to listen about historical approach or more current one. So then I think that is add a lot to what we are thinking of or trying to improve our understanding about the proposal that we brought here to be discussed. This is the idea, to listen different opinions about. And of course that like your question made me consider a lot of ways. Know that we are, and it makes sense, for instance, to think about the cost of what we are intending to do. But in this case, I think that it would be very interesting also to ask, would be the cost to not do anything? So that I'm sure it would be incredibly higher than to do. And so I was thinking about to...
For whom?
Huh?
For whom?
For whom?
What's the cost?
No, I won't be able to reply, but I would say it's a kind of feeling, you know, it's like when you are about to change the state, you know. We are, if I say in degree, in Celsius degree, it is like if we had all of the water in 99 degrees, Celsius degrees. And so, if we keep going just one more degree, it's nothing, but we are going to lose everything. So, it's this kind of situation. So, you talked about colonization, but this is what we are living since the beginning. You know. Of course, the kind of disaster, no, are you from Argentina? So you know what I'm really talking about. It's something that...
Thank you. You're worse than you.
We learned very, so this is kind of, we have have no choice. And I think that the proposal, and this is, to me, is very important, the proposal that Alexandre brought, I'm always very, we talk sometimes, no, I wouldn't like to have this project misunderstood as a kind of mega project or a huge project. And my feeling, and I would like to communicate it much better, is that this project is not is much more something that is being revealed, that is being uncovered. I would say literally uncovered, because most part of the rivers we have in São Paulo were covered. So it's much more an archaeology. It's much more just showing than to build. there is no construction. The rivers were there. It's not being posed. It's just the geography that we.
Then you restore it. Restoration of geography.
In a way, I think it's pretty much like this. So, but when it is shown, it could be taken as a mega project or something like it. And I don't feel like this. I think that is a very delicate approach. It's much more a way to show what we were not trained to see. So, but this is one point.
I mean,
No, I just would like to thank you.
No, that's it's a very important issue because things look huge and mega, but actually, in my own experience, having visited different sites, I know that everyone is looked at as a very different condition, and it's more like, let's say, that the full geometry of the project and the fact that it looks like a circle, let's say, makes you think in terms of those dimensions, but we know that that's not what it is. And in fact, the determinants, that's what I always understood, of the scale are the possibility, the intermodal possibilities because of the intersection between roads, train, and water. And those, in a way, create the first triangle. And then, as Angelo just said, the rivers are there. So, in a way, it's really about digging and uncovering something that we know exists. And in principle, I think that it's another possible way for architecture to be exercised, which is not just with a metaphor. The textual metaphor is not just about writing, it's also about reading. Is it suddenly the particular lens we have, or the particular toolkit we have, makes it possible for you to see things. And I think that that's what I take from the Idwa now. That is, I see it as a geographic reading of one of the largest cities in the world. And in that way, I thought that it was really very much, I was incredibly appropriate what Chris showed at the beginning of the day. And I was telling Bruno, it's so great to go back to geography because that's something that it's very scarce these days. And your images somehow were worked out in a certain way that brought up certain geographic conditions in the clearest possible way. So anyway, I thought, I'm now also adding my comments, but I thought that I wanted to say that before you.
Yeah, I do have to cut out.
Yes,
But it was a really wonderful conference.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and anyway, we'll definitely be in touch. Okay, yes. Okay, thanks again. So,
well, I was going to make a very quick comment because I've been thinking about Barry, you brought up this question of reversibility, and there's actually something very interesting about how this, not a return, but a kind of working with like a natural movement of water is actually reversing certain trends of urbanism while moving things others forward. So in some ways, the binary before and after is now much more complicated, which goes back to Allison's comment about this kind of looping of these things in a not a kind of linear direction to history. And that's what I find super fascinating about even starting to allow water to come back into neighborhoods that were not that were former wetlands. And again, but I'm amazed at how frequently people position binary as the only models, like we either retreat or we fortify as an example. And so using design as a way to, in a sense, kind of look at new futures that are not simply, a kind of single avenue through the kind of archive of history, but starting to loop them in different ways. And that's I think, tends to make for richer projects.
I also would like to go back to something that Vera brought up in comparing your what in terms of today's discussion, your micro scale with the neighborhood and São Paulo being 27 million people, because in my book, New Jersey is a city. That is, it's basically denser than as a territory than any other state in America, than Holland, than Japan. And you could say it's, I mean, it doesn't sound possible, but that's what it is. So in a way, I see what Paul is doing is taking a biopsy in the body of this other type of city that we know is totally unsustainable as a model, while in fact São Paulo, with its density, with all the problems that extreme density brings, at least in some areas of São Paulo, seems to me a lot more sustainable than the entire state of New Jersey. So, so that's, you know, that's also a question that perhaps should be considered. So Christina, I don't know if you want to
just
give us.
No, I was only thinking about that the project is going very well, and we have a good yes, no, it's for us it's very important to be here and to present the project of Alexandre, and our team is working. And as you see, it's an academic, but it's also the possibility of thinking about new policy for not only São Paulo, but for the region. As Ricardo showed us, we have a lot of problems now, and I think that it's a responsibility of our university. It's a public university, and we have to deal with the problem, and we have to deal in both ways. And that's coming here and hearing the magnificent exposition of Chris, and also the project that you show us. It's a way of thinking about what we have to deal. And as I was saying to Mario first, we have to, this is a 3-year project, so we have to have the possibility of talking about, but taking with us all the explanations, all the debates for the next step that we are having this year. I think this is a very important issue we have to do, we have to have in this project. I think it. Thank you, Mario and Bruno.
No, thank you actually for coming. I also wanted to answer very briefly the question that Vera asked. I don't think it was just a rhetorical question, like when you asked, what am I doing here as a historian? And I think it's really perhaps one of the most important questions for this project, because as I said very briefly in my 3-second introduction, what we consider this, at least from the Princeton side, an interdisciplinary project. And we feel that what's really important and what Princeton can offer is this dialogue where we come from very different ends and very different points of views. And I think that brings an element, a different element, because you might, I mean, that is we're playing with chats, I would say. You might come, we're playing with chats. You know, we're playing with questions that we usually don't ask ourselves. And some of those questions might force us to answer and to rethink our own positions, because in a way the dialogue within architecture and within architecture and engineering is always bouncing the same, the same set of issues. And for instance, having a historian and bringing the long durée, the long. Obviously, it's crucial for the type of issues that we're discussing here. For the, I mean, the mega in the temporal axis should correspond to the mega in the spatial axis, which is what we're doing here. And you know, I think that there is definitely a very important role for the humanities and the social sciences in projects that were exclusively seen as technological projects, or you know, let's say you know, building projects. And I think we're having now, for instance, this experience exactly now, co-teaching the course, and our students are. I mean, we had a rotating group of students because they have classes, but it's. I think we're both learning from.
Yeah. Yeah, I was going to pick up
Sorry,
from there.
yes.
No, and try to weave in some of the themes we've been discussing, sort of back to some of the stuff that I brought up, and then to very different case studies of the afternoon session. So by way of comparison, having established all the ways in which these are very incomparable projects, I mean, Vera, I think if we want to hold on to the, you know, we all agree, archaic categories of civilization nature, we really can and should think of these as de-civilizing projects, right? To the extent that they soften the boundaries between built environment and natural systems, right? So obviously they're not conceived in these, within these categories in mind, but right, if we are to be, you know, crusaders against civilization, I think that we have allies in the room. And something Angela mentioned, I wrote down, before you said that I showed to Paul to prove, that I also wrote down when the question of cost came up, the cost of not doing anything, right? Which is applicable in the case of São Paulo, which is the cost of, you know, takes you 3 hours to get to work in the morning, you have sewage running down your house. It's very applicable in the case of New Jersey as well, right? There's a huge cost to not doing, basically letting these neighborhoods be. And I think partly what's, at least to me, the interest in having these stories in the room is basically what you have, you know, done, what Allison did with Christine, just enlarge the limits of the thinkable, right? So sort of the default mode in these discussions is often, is this viable, and considering it in a very, very small temporal scale. And looking back, not that long ago in a geological or environmental scale, we are frequently, all the time, confronted with the impossible happening, right? If before the period Chris began with, anyone had predicted what did happen 30, 40, 50, 100 years later, they would have been laughed off of any room they might have been in. Right? So I think we need to sort of recuperate this enlarged sense of the thinkable and possible, because the crises we are in demands it.
Yes.
It's very important, this meeting, like Professor Christine told, for us is to reach our debate about the new possibilities to interlink the several interdisciplinary discussions. For example, Alison this morning, Vera, and also Paula, show us several possibilities to go ahead with the debate. In this case of the Atlantic City, Chelsea, I remember the possibility to think about from the New Amsterdam in the past, aim to the future, the Netherlands, not exactly put the Netherlands in the intercoastal from Miami to Boston, but understand this from the historic hydrological, geological conditions, how we can invent a new kind of metropolitan area, like Canal City from Miami to Boston, that considered the floating city or Palafita city, the new pilotis. In Brazil, Amazonica University had several kinds of floating houses and floating cities, covered by shadow for trees, flooding trees, forest, sorry. It is instilling our imaginary, stimulating our imaginary. Then bring it to this table, the historic dimension. Remember for us that in 1994 we organized a seminar at the School of Architecture about this question, Metroplis Fluvial. The things are triad, the architecture, project, and history. But we can try and change for project as history, or history as project. Because the history is very stimulant for us. Understand, for example, that how to create the river basin in the past was a lake, Titicaca, and then passing a wetland, and then transforming in a desert. It's very interesting. But it's very important to understand that South America is the vision of Alexander von Humboldt about the possibility to interconnect Orinoco River with Amazonas or Amazônia, and then in the 19th century, a Brazilian engineer proposed this interconnected river basin. It's very important for build our imaginary. It's very important, especially for think about Frederick II or Alexander Peter the Great, because Peter the Great, Russian, right? Think about the dream to link the White Sea, Baltic Sea, and Black Sea, and create the new city. Of course, today, if we think about the idea of concluding, the title of our project is Fluvial Metropolis, megacities, infrastructure, and the city as a whole. It's home. Home is more than 4 walls and a shelter. Home is infrastructure. And the infrastructure of infrastructure is the water, the energy, utilities. Then if you think about 3 important intellectuals, Brazilian, Anísio Teixeira, for example, that think about the possibility to join philosophy and arts for construction of the imaginary and the action of people. And then another educator, Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, talk about more than Canal City, about the learning city. It's very important to include the people that actually is the payment, the country, the working class. The working class actually pay the account. It suffer the disaster. It's very important. Remember, because the first mission of architecture is avoid the disaster. In our public school of architecture, our the undergraduate students, we talking for students that have 19 years old, that stimulate that they have pleasure and honor and is a public servant, public officer in the city of Brazil, because working with urban infrastructure, public facilities and social housing. Because social housing is infrastructure. That is very important to understand for us this possibility to together with difference build our place. We name it architecture of place. The first architecture, or the second, the first is avoid the disaster. The second is together with the difference. We invite, design and build our place. The second, the third also is architecture of program, because the architecture of program is collective authority.
Authorship.
Authorship. And I like so much the Levi Vygotsky. Levi Vygotsky, young and that 32 years old. But Vygotsky talk about the concept about social belongings of space. Apropriação social do espaço. About. Then this joint research project, Princeton course, for us is very happy to believe that's possible. Construction a constellation of cultural corners of cultural works. Understand like a place where the people meeting trust with differences. Yeah.
So Vera, I feel that if you really could to count on you, to count on someone who in the next meeting is going to ask for whom and who's paying for it as a conclusion.
You want me to?
Yes, definitely.
You asked
And
for
I mean, look what you generate in terms of discussion. So I finally, I'd like to ask Kevin, Zach, Eva, if you have any comments before we close the session. I mean,
you guys get the last word.
You get the last word, if you feel like it. I mean, it's not an assignment.
Of course it's an assignment.
Okay.
Yeah. Speak.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I think this conference today sort of really expanded my horizons, because I feel like a lot when I examine problems like this, I always take this sort of binary approach to looking at solutions, like either this or that, or really this sort of black and white look. And I think both projects, both restoring these sort of natural water flows throughout a city and looking at the way marshland interacts with the city and the urban form itself, looking at these sort of non-binary approaches to finding solutions has really opened up doors to looking at other things and other problems and approaching different problems in a similar manner.
I think the biggest thing for me, I'm a student in the engineering school, and we had one class for our seminar where we focused on like the why history theme, And I think that that's something that came up today again, that is something that's definitely not emphasized in engineering school, is like this historical focus, that when you come to look at, you have some kind of problem, you're trying to find a solution, the focus is always in the engineering school just to, do a cost analysis study, to, think about, direct consequences of, design decisions. But to have a broader focus when you're approaching these, interrelated problems and making like a more developed, or having a more developed understanding of problems as a system, and as something that happens with context is something I think that's really valuable and something we're working on today.
You're an engineer?
Yeah.
What's your name?
Kevin?
Kevin. You're Zach?
Yes.
I've seen you in the technical.
Yeah, I thought you talking about history was really, really interesting, and you talking about reverting back to, sort of going back to the geography, like uncovering the past geography that's kind of like hidden now, and using that to inform how the cities can change into the future. I think that was really interesting, and I also thought your point about the issue of technology, like just because we have new technology doesn't mean that we forget about the old ones, or we don't use the old ones anymore. So I thought integrating new and old in that sense could also be very interesting.
These are two kind of unrelated notes, but the first thing was I just had a thought about what Mario and Angela were talking about, like thinking of this project as sort of like an archaeological project. I think that's really an interesting way to put it, and I don't know if I don't know, from my understanding, I don't know if I necessarily agree, just because I think that, well, something you said, Mario, is like, it's about like digging and uncovering something that we know exists, and I think that that language is just very interesting, and thinking about how it could be used to justify very sort of violent infrastructural projects. I mean, the idea of digging and uncovering that could be used as sort of rhetorical justification for any sort of like exploitation of natural resources, but it also could be used in a non-violent way in a more natural way to mediate technology and non-technological approaches. The other thing I was thinking was what you were talking about economic growth, and I mean, we don't really have time to go into it, but I was just curious to hear more about what you're talking about, the unbearable social explosion that will happen if we do not promote economic growth. And I don't know, what you said sort of struck me, just because I don't know, I was very, I don't think I really agree. I don't mean to be offensive, but I don't agree with the idea that growth is preferable to avoid like an economic freezing you're talking about. I thought it was interesting, but I disagree with the social costs that you think are being prioritized in development, in choosing development over not developing. But I mean, I don't know enough about it.
Okay, so well, I thought it was important, since you've been here most of the day, all day, to hear your voices. And anyway, I want to thank everybody for their contribution, their presence, and I guess tomorrow the basic team is getting together tomorrow morning for a couple of hours to plan the overall strategy and the tactics for the next few meetings. So again, thanks, and
Thank you.
Thank you.
yeah.
Thank you.